Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Congressman Darren LaHood. I want to welcome everybody to our subcommittee hearing today in the Sam Johnson room, our first subcommittee hearing for our subcommittee Work and Welfare. And our title of our hearing today is Welfare is Broken, Restoring Work Requirements to Lift Americans Out of Poverty. And so I want to thank everybody for being here today. I have an opening statement that I'm going to give, and then I'll turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Davis. And then I'll have our full committee chairman, Mr. Smith. He'll have a statement, and then we'll introduce our witnesses. Well, good afternoon and welcome. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this important hearing on how we can restore work requirements to lift more Americans out of poverty. I currently represent the 16th District of Illinois, which covers central and northwestern part of our state. As chairman of the Work and Welfare Subcommittee, I'm proud of this committee's longstanding leadership and multi-year efforts to pass constructive and responsible welfare reform. This subcommittee has consistently enacted policies that reduce poverty by helping families achieve self-sufficiency through the dignity and value of work. As we all remember, the 1996 Bipartisan Welfare Reform Act, signed by President Bill Clinton with the help of a Republican Congress at the time, converted our nation's welfare system from an open-ended entitlement, which caused rising welfare caseloads, long durations in poverty, and rising single parenthood, into the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, also known as TANF, which provides fixed funding to states and for the first time required work in exchange for benefits. The primary goal of the TANF program is to assist families in need with a hand up, providing a safety net of government assistance to find work and pull themselves out of poverty. Since passage of the 1996 Reform Bill, welfare caseloads have dropped over 80%, and that's a good thing, as families moved into the workforce and left the cycle of dependency. The benefits of the 1996 bipartisan welfare reform have persisted decades after its passage, with children today half as likely to grow up below the poverty threshold. Not only that, but among single-parent families, deep poverty fell from around 5% before the reform to less than 1% today. Despite these gains over the years, work requirements in TANF have fallen flat because current law includes many loopholes that have been exploited by a number of states across the country. Likewise, federal rules on what counts and does not count towards the federal work participation rate can create obstacles for moving some individuals into the workforce. Even though we know a job is the best way out of poverty, this has led to thousands of TANF recipients having 0 hours of, quote, engaged in work, unquote, reported to the Department of Health and Human Services. In fact, 57% of the work-eligible individuals on TANF recorded 0 hours of work in 2021. Ways and Means Republicans are dedicated to ensuring that there is accountability for federal taxpayer dollars across programs and that states are not able to game the system and avoid engaging their current TANF caseloads in opportunities for work. We want to find solutions to help states, localities, and caseworkers effectively work with low-income families to remove barriers and support self-sufficiency by equipping them with the skills they need to be successful in the labor market. The timing of this hearing and strengthening TANF work requirements could not be better. Today, there are nearly 11 million open jobs across the country, or 1.7 for every worker. Our country's employers and small businesses are clamoring for workers to fill these roles. Despite a growing economy and workforce participation rate, our workforce participation rate is currently 62.5%, still below the pre-pandemic level. Programs that lack work requirements, such as the temporary work-free cash payments Democrats provided through the expanded child tax credit last year, do nothing to address the underlying problems that may be holding a family back from success. We cannot have a safety net system that incentivizes government dependency by paying people more not to work. I'm proud that we have a support system in place, but it should be a trampoline, not a generational poverty trap. Ways and Means Republicans are dedicated to helping individuals on the sidelines move into the workforce and attain their full potential. We must reform TANF to uplift recipients to a path of self-sufficiency and bolster our workforce. We cannot afford to relegate an entire generation of workers to the sidelines. I sincerely hope that we can work together in a bipartisan way, similar to the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, on improving the TANF program to restore the focus on the work preparation activities, training, support services, and case management that it takes to meaningfully lift Americans out of poverty in a sustained way. This can and should be a bipartisan effort. I'm honored to have our guests here today to share their perspectives and expertise on TANF and moving individuals into our workforce and out of poverty. With that, I am pleased at this time to recognize my colleague from our home state of Illinois, Ranking Member Danny Davis, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me add my words of welcome to our witnesses. It's indeed a pleasure to serve on this committee with you and provide part of the leadership. So I am certain that we're going to have a very productive period of time. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program is a program for families with children. 2/3 of TANF recipients are children, and nearly 70% of them are under age 12. Over 1/3 of TANF children are infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. The primary goal of TANF should be to reduce adversity for poor children by providing stability and support for their families. Instead of focusing on how to help children, today's hearing topic seems to blame parents, grandparents, and other caregivers for their poverty and suggests that the solution is work requirements. There are many ways we could strengthen TANF, but placing more burdens and blame on parents, grandparents, and caregivers is not one of them. TANF fails to help the vast majority of poor families. Only about 1 million families receive TANF income support, and the average monthly benefit in 2021 was $517, with 14 states paying an average of $300 or less. Most families receive child-only TANF. That is an even more paltry sum. This meager support is shameful, given the clear evidence that living in poverty causes both short and long-term health problems for children, damaging their futures and also leading to unexpected and costly doctor visits that undermine work for their parents, especially for low-level entry jobs. TANF fails families by imposing crushing administrative burdens designed to kick them off under the guise of accountability. In fiscal year 2021, the single most common reason for TANF case closing was failure to comply with administrative requirements. It was a missed meeting, a late report, or a missed signature, not refusal to work. TANF fails to remove the barriers faced by millions of family caregivers. Nearly 1/4 of children currently receiving TANF assistance are raised by grandparents. For these families, TANF benefits, however small, can be a lifeline, maybe enough to avoid selling their home or draining their retirement savings. In Chandler Hoods and my state of Illinois, an estimated 75,000 families with young children are headed by grandparents. But most grandparents-headed families do not receive TANF despite dire financial need. I hope that we can work together to make it easier, not harder, for kinship families to get help from TANF. TANF fails to invest in career pathways, and in the last Congress, my Republican colleagues opposed our efforts to continue the evidence-based career pathway health profession opportunity grant program. Witness after witness, both Republican and Democratic, has stressed the critical importance of improving educational opportunities for TANF recipients so that they can access higher caliber, good-paying jobs. But when this committee had a chance to do it, many of my colleagues said no. If our goal is to address the worker shortage, our peer countries have demonstrated that guaranteed child care and paid family and medical leave substantially increase workforce participation among women. Parents and grandparents that need help from TANF don't need more penalties, requirements, and paperwork. They need child care. They need a safe place to live, food to eat, reliable transportation, good education, and health care. If we want to support work, that's where we need to start. Every American relies on the federal government for help sometimes. These investments benefit us all. They can make us the country we want to be, lifting the burdens from vulnerable families so that children can thrive. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. At this time, I'm very pleased to have our full committee chairman here, Chairman Jason Smith, for an opening statement.
Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, it's a pleasure to join you for the first hearing of the Work and Welfare Subcommittee in the 118th Congress. This is a first step in ensuring that welfare programs work for America's families by helping lift them out of poverty and instead of keeping them trapped. I know the reality faced by working class families in America because I've lived it. My grandparents never had running water. I grew up with my family living in a single wide trailer, and then we upgraded to a double wide when I was in high school. My father was a preacher and an auto mechanic, and my mother, she went to work in a factory just so she could provide health insurance for our family. Families like the one I grew up in and millions of others across America, they do the best they can to stretch every dollar to make ends meet. Millions of families go through rough patches through no fault of their own, and they need help. And when done correctly, welfare can be the bridge to build a better life for families who are struggling. No one's dream is to spend their lives on government assistance. Parents want to have the opportunity to provide for their families, put food on the table, clothes on their kids' backs, and a roof over their heads. If we don't get welfare right, then we run the risk of trapping people in a generational cycle of poverty that makes a government check more valuable than a job and robs them from the dignity of work. We already see what happens when people are discouraged from working. In our country, labor force participation still hasn't caught up to where it was before COVID. There are nearly 2 jobs currently available for every worker. The simple fact is that work provides people a lifeline and a purpose. It connects them to their communities and rewards achievement. The bipartisan welfare reform of 1996 vindicated that approach as child poverty fell and caseloads were reduced. Welfare was a stepping stone for families, not a dead end. Today, the welfare system needs modernization. According to the Foundation for Government Accountability, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, only about 3 million of the roughly 48.5 million able-bodied adults who received Medicaid, TANF, food stamps, public housing, or child care benefits were subject to any work requirement. In 2021, the vast majority of states had a 0% work participation requirement for TANF, meaning many states are not being held accountable for maximizing the number of individuals on their caseloads who are engaged in work. Government policies have too often encouraged Americans not to work, resulting in increased dependency and millions of unfilled jobs. We should be exploring every possibility to get our fellow Americans back into the labor force, including strengthening work requirements across all government programs. I hope this can be the area where Congress can come together and ensure that our welfare policies will work for a new generation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. We will now introduce our witnesses here today. I'll start from my left and go right. Our first witness is Mr. Grant Collins, who is the Senior Vice President for Workforce Development at the FedCap Group. Next, we'll have Shakira Francis, and Shakira is the Employment Services Social Worker Supervisor for the Mecklenburg County, North Carolina Department of Social Services Employment Services Division. Thirdly, we'll hear from Ms. Heather Reynolds from South Bend, Indiana. She is the Managing Director at the Lab for Economic Opportunities at the University of Notre Dame. Next, we'll hear from Jacob Moss from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and he is the Chief Executive Officer at West Michigan Works. And lastly, we'll hear from Ms. Victoria Gray of Arizona, and she is a loving grandmother of 7 grandchildren and 41 foster children. Welcome to you all. With that, Mr. Collins, you are recognized for 5 minutes to deliver your opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on restoring the work requirement to lift Americans out of poverty. I lead on workforce development for the FedCap Group, a company dedicated to improving the economic well-being of those with barriers to work. I'm pleased to be here today as I wish to offer a few insights from my current role and my former role as Deputy Director of the Office of Family Assistance, the federal agency that oversees the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. It was our office that drafted the TANF regulations as a result of the passage of the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005. In particular, I'm here to outline some of the current loopholes that impact the program, to provide some insights regarding the approaches we took in 2005 to strengthen TANF, and to share some recommendations. States must keep at least 50% of adults participating in activities like employment, job search, or vocational training. States receive credit toward meeting the 50% work rate if they reduce caseloads over time. For example, if a state had a caseload of 10,000 in 1997 and reduced it by 5,000 by 2002, its 2003 work participation requirement would have been 0. Currently, states have utilized a few ways to meet the work requirement, to do little to further the objectives of the TANF program. Some states move selected cases from TANF into solely state-funded programs, which are not subject to TANF rules, and states increase their rates by adding already working families, by adding small amounts of TANF cash assistance to their case so that they can count. While these practices are allowable, they fail to address those with real barriers and need for assistance. In FY 21, 57% of TANF cases had 0 hours in any work activity for the entire year. Another key provision of welfare reform is what is called maintenance of effort, or MOE requirements. MOE makes sure that states continue to invest their own money in the program. While the federal government provides actual cash, currently many more states use eligible TANF expenditures to meet MOE requirements rather than actual spending on TANF work activities and supports. For example, a state might decide to provide a scholarship fund for low-income families out of their education department. That expenditure may then qualify as state MOE if it is reported as meeting a TANF purpose, even though the scholarships may not go to TANF recipients. While this practice is allowable, if overused, it weakens the federal-state partnership, as states have little skin in the game when it comes to moving more of the caseload into activities that lead to sustainable employment. These are only some of the ways around these requirements. It's important to address the full array of current work and MOE requirement loopholes if the goal is to move more to work. The Bush reforms sought to strengthen the work requirement and the federal-state partnership. The DRA defined work activities, required work activities to be supervised, and required states address their internal controls via a work verification plan. Specifically, we recalibrated the base year for the caseload reduction credit from 1996 to 2005. Work requirements can be strengthened by recalibrating the base year for the credit on a biannual basis. Defining work activities to include evidence-based parenting education, pre-apprenticeships, and apprenticeships can help more families be ready for jobs in the new economy. A new high-performance bonus focused on outcomes such as job entry, job retention, and earnings increases could provide the impetus for states to continue to work with those who are employed to further improve their economic mobility. Overall, states should be applauded for their efforts at getting people into work. Under new reforms, our nation's social safety net can become the economic trampoline for thousands of Americans who can succeed in work and exit poverty. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, and Ranking Member Davis for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. We'll turn now to Ms. Francis.
Good afternoon, Committee Chairman Smith, Subcommittee Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the current Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program from my perspective as a social work supervisor in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. In my current role, I manage a team of social workers with active caseloads. I am also responsible for reviewing, analyzing, and implementing current TANF processes. My remarks today will describe our engagement approach, measurement challenges, and observations based on my frontline and supervisory experience. The Mecklenburg County Department of Community Resources, through the Work First Employment Services Program, provides social work services to eligible participants of the TANF program. Our county is in one of the 9 states that delegates TANF administration, including maintenance of effort requirements to counties. Our services include removing barriers to employment, which include assisting with referrals in connection to community resources such as housing, behavioral and physical health, substance use, food, transportation, childcare, and other daily needs. Each participant is engaged in an initial assessment in which a personal information form is used to gather pertinent information regarding the customer's family, educational, health, and employment background. A mutual responsibility agreement is completed with participants that indicates activities the participant is required to complete to receive their monthly benefits and the actions the social worker will take to assist the customer in reaching their full potential in the program. The agreement outlines the required hours the participant must complete each month, which correlates with the required monthly rate. The agreement also specifically spells out the hours required each week along with the participant's assigned component. The Work First program currently uses a participation rate to measure the success of participants. The Work First customer must participate in a set number of core components, including independent job search, job readiness classes, vocational training, work experience, and other activities regulated through state and federal guidelines. However, measuring our participants' performance by the number of hours completed only provides data for half the story. Focusing on the rate as the only means of measurement for success within the Work First program removes the human aspect of the program. Participants in the program are often overcoming immense obstacles such as trauma, homelessness, mental and physical health concerns, substance use issues, and yet are required to fully participate in the program. The current participation rate does not measure comprehensive family success. It also does not measure a customer successfully completing substance abuse treatment and family reunification. Nor does the participation rate measure a family securing housing to stabilize their family to be able to work. These types of actions by a participant indicate successful movement towards self-sustainability. However, individuals do enter the TANF program ready to immediately participate in employment activities with little to no barriers and may simply need assistance with connecting to job leads and vocational training. However, as mentioned previously, there are several participants who have barriers that need to be addressed prior to becoming employment ready. Unfortunately, these participants are required to meet the monthly mandatory participation rates while at the same time having to address their barriers towards stability. Another struggle within the TANF program is the effectiveness of the TANF components. The components are arranged between countable and non-countable activities. Some of these countable activities can only be used for a short period of time. Capping the amount of job search, job readiness hours available to a customer does not benefit participants in a downward economy or an individual who has limited educational or employment skill sets. Statistical measurements of the Work First program would benefit from focusing on tangible successes of participants rather than a rate. These tangible successes could include the measurement of the number of participants who obtain employment within a set period of time from their entrance into the Work First program. Customers who successfully complete vocational training or increase their educational status while participating in the TANF program should also be considered a successful measurement. In the sake of time, I will close with an example from our program. A 25-year-old mother of one applied for TANF assistance in January 2022. Customer was seeking financial assistance securing employment, and child care. Customer had little family support and reported relocating to the city to find better job opportunities. Her career focus was on healthcare, customer service, and clerical work. She received assistance from a Work First employment social worker. After assessing her situation, she was assisted with child care, mileage reimbursement, and connected to a mental health professional. Overall, she was successful in addressing her mental health needs and secured full-time employment, earning $22 an hour or $42,000 per year. Mr. Chairman and committee members, on behalf of our county manager and board, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today.
Thank you, Ms. Francis. I will now recognize Ms. Reynolds.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. I serve at the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, or LEO, at the University of Notre Dame, where we work with innovative service providers to build rigorous evidence around programs designed to move people permanently out of poverty. Prior to joining LEO, I spent 2 decades as CEO of Catholic Charities Fort Worth. The clients we had the honor to serve are who taught me about poverty, struggle, and strength, and also about the incredible disconnect that exists between policy and on-the-ground work. The TANF program is one in particular that is particularly head-scratching to me. I observed many clients that benefited from TANF and many more working poor that were not qualified. I observed how recipients were required to often do various activities to keep their benefits, but these activities often had little to do with actually getting them into the workforce. In the research we conduct at LEO, I see studies that show us what works to put people on a pathway out of poverty. These experiences lead me to express 3 points to you today. First, TANF needs to be restructured in a way that gives people a way out of poverty. I will never forget Christina as I sat in on a meeting with her about savings. As her case manager broached the subject, Christina, a single mom with 2 children, responded, "I am a great saver." Her strategies were sound. Every time she used her debit card, she got $5 cash back and put it toward her savings. Her case manager asked where she saved it. In a plastic piggy bank in the back of my closet. And when her case manager asked how much, she shared, $6,000. This single mom was a great saver. She worked part-time because she had small children to care for and no help after fleeing a domestic violence situation. She was going to school supported by Catholic Charities to be ready for a living wage job once her youngest hit kindergarten. Until then, she couldn't put her money in a bank. Why? It would be an asset and she would lose all public benefits. She would have to spend her savings. She would have to try to get back on benefits, and the time lapse would cause her to go into debt. When she did get that living wage job, she would have no savings, but she would have plenty of debt. She had kept her money in the back of her closet because for Christina, it was the soundest financial decision she could make. Christina needed TANF dollars, her part-time job, and support from Catholic Charities to stay afloat while she worked to improve her situation. Second, TANF needs to be designed in a way where financial assistance is flexible and case management is robust. I met Rose's family when they were about to be evicted. Her husband was making $24,000 a year. Rosa needed to get to work. Catholic Charities got Rosa a job and she quit. We got her another job and she quit. Most of us would say maybe Rosa wasn't serious about wanting to work, but Rosa's case manager knew her way too well to believe that. Rosa was placing her son, her 2-year-old son, in a daycare situation that would make most of us moms shudder. It was all she could afford. Her case manager made a deal with Rosa. Rosa would find a safe, reasonably priced childcare center. We would pay for the first 3 months and then half the cost of the next 3 months, as long as Rosa kept that job. This afforded her to accomplish all of her goals: a safe place for her son, the ability to work, and the ability to get 6 months of paychecks under her belt before the whole childcare bill fell to her. And guess what? Rosa is a certified IT specialist, promoted 3 times over the last 6 years. Her family is thriving, and she's never had to ask for help since. Rosa benefited from flexible funding to help her with her most pressing need: safe, quality childcare, so she could increase her financial standing as a family. And third, we have got to let evidence lead the way. TANF funds are used for many things, including job training, childcare, and cash assistance. We don't have great information about which of these efforts work, and in some cases, research shows us they don't work. Evidence building and usage has got to be key in reform. At LEO, we have over 90 research partners building evidence to help us understand what works. We take the most creative leaders across social services, design studies with them, understanding the impact of their services. These organizations do it because they believe if they can understand their impact, it can be used to scale and replicate their work. It is your role to pay attention to this evidence and to use it. As policymakers, you need to be shouting from the rooftops, or said another way, allocating public policy dollars to allow their evidence-based solutions to scale because they work. In closing, it is an honor to serve at the University of Notre Dame, who has a clear mandate to be a force for good in our country. The research we are producing continues to tell us the way to move low-income Americans to a life outside of poverty is through flexible financial assistance and case management. The answers are there. We just need you to follow the evidence.
Thank you, Ms. Reynolds. We'll now recognize Mr. Moss for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of this subcommittee. West Michigan Works serves as a local workforce development agency, and our region consists of 7 counties, annually serving approximately 3,000 employers and 40,000 job seekers out of 8 service centers, 3 satellite offices, and many home offices. I am very passionate about the population we serve, especially in our TANF programs. If there's one thing that I've learned over the years, it's when you directly impact an individual, you are impacting their family, and you're impacting the community. I started my career in workforce development 20 years ago as an employer account representative in the Michigan Works Network, working directly with job seekers who were receiving TANF, preparing them for employment, and with employers who would hire, train, and retain those individuals. Early in my career, I was ill-prepared as the barriers were far more complicated than college prepared me for. I remember picking up individuals from their homes to get them to work on time when public transportation failed them. I remember going to an individual's home following up on why he did not show up to work, only to find he was dealing with a family crisis as his teenager ran away from home. I also remember running into individuals at our local Meijer who were thankful for working together and excited to tell me about their new job. While the circumstances surrounding each of their lives was unique, it was clear to me that they were not looking for a handout, but rather a hand up. Our TANF program handled all things employment training related and gave them the hand up they needed. Those services included orientation of the program, soft skills development, barrier removal, career planning, high school equivalency or GED prep, referrals to short-term training programs, support services, transitional supports, and helping retain employment. I held several other positions while working in the TANF program, including manager and assistant manager. In 2010, I transitioned to administration of programs, and since then I've served on several statewide committees involving process and policy improvements to our TANF program. Early in my career, our state was at risk of $36 million in sanctions for not meeting work participation rate requirements. The challenge was that our infrastructure and IT systems were ill-equipped to track work participation rates, programs weren't designed to meet work participation rates, and a large number of individuals were enrolled in activities that didn't count towards their participation rate, despite being better suited to help the individual in the long run. For example, An individual couldn't be enrolled and still can't be enrolled in GED full-time. Individuals could only be in training programs for a short period of time before their hours stopped counting, even if the individual is on track to get their credential and increase their earnings. We were and are still dealing with difficult rules like having the 5th week of job search not count toward participation hours, and individuals who are referred to us in the middle of the month who have a slim chance of meeting work participation rate for the month. It makes no sense to me that their hours wouldn't be prorated for the month depending on when they were referred. Bottom line is that work participation rate doesn't work. Fortunately, in Michigan, due to partnerships we have with our state departments of labor and economic opportunity and Department of Health and Human Services, also known as the PATH program, we have been able to solve these problems through caseload reduction credits, where we can enroll a small percentage of individuals into high school equivalency and GED completion. Implemented in 2020, it provides an opportunity for participants to pursue high school completion or equivalency without facing the adverse effects of not meeting the work participation rate requirement. The challenge is that culturally, there's still the mindset that we must meet performance locally. In our region, we were dealing with 5 different DHS directors who are held to the standard of work participation rate, and one person can fail performance for that DHS, especially in our rural counties. I applaud the committee's challenge of reimagining what TANF can look like. Working directly with the population in a variety of roles, I have learned a few things that I hope you'll find useful. We'd like to offer a few suggestions from our organization. Focus on outcomes, not outputs. Work participation rate doesn't work. Consider aligning the outcomes with Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which is about credential attainment, employment retention, and earnings. When designing the program, we'd be comfortable with participation hours, but each individual's needs are going to be unique. Allow the states and local areas the flexibility to enroll them in programs that are best suited for the individuals, and certainly allow high school equivalency GED and post-secondary training as options. And maybe a dream to me, but consider integrating programs. Texas and Michigan have unique models where workforce development boards are delivering Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, Wagner-Pfizer, Trade Act, and welfare reform. A siloed approach to employment training programs creates confusion for employers and job seekers alike. Just as our employers don't care where our funding streams are coming from, neither do our job seekers. At the end of the day, our job seekers just want a decent paying job, and our employers just want the talent they need to remain competitive. We have a local success story submitted in my written statement. With that, I just want to open it up for opportunity for questions. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. At this time, we will hear from Ms. Gray for 5 minutes. You're recognized. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman LaHood, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the commitment to families that you do and the opportunity to speak to you today about the critical role temporary assistance to needy family plays in the lives of grandparents and other relatives that are raising children, also known as grandfamilies or kinship families. My name is Victoria Gray, and I've become an advocate for grandfamilies after discovering firsthand the difficulties that they face as we raise 7 grandchildren, some of whom have severe medical and behavior issues. As an advocate and a professional, I serve as a Generations United Grand Voice, and I am the founder and executive director of the nonprofit Gray Nickel, Inc., supporter of kinship families in Arizona. I routinely connect grandfamilies to TANF, which is an essential source of the support for children. When parents are unable to raise their children, grandparents step up to provide protection, stability, and love. Currently, more than 2.5 million children are raised by grandfamilies. Collectively, we save our country more than $4 billion a year, keeping children out of foster care. My husband and I were both working. We had 2 teenagers at home. We received a call that our granddaughter, who was medically fragile, was placed into foster care. We stepped up to care for her and received about $17 a month for diapers. We were not told about TANF at that time. The additional support would have been a huge help to my family, but work requirements are a barrier for families like mine. My granddaughter was born in 29 weeks at 1 pound, 2 ounces. Her lungs were not fully developed. She had 2 holes in her heart, a frontal lobe cyst. She had cloudiness of both eyes. We were told she would have limited to no vision. We could not find a child care center that would accept the responsibility or the liability for taking this child in. I had to quit work to care for her. Later that year, her brother was placed with us. We found out that he was not biologically linked to us, so we became foster parents in order to keep him in the home with his sister. When we did get licensed, we received $500 a month in foster care for him. We were caring for two siblings in the same house. Both had special needs, but we got vastly less support for our granddaughter because we were related to her. Grandparents are not expecting to raise a child in retirement, but step up with little to no warning. TANF is one of the few sources of support for children outside of the foster care system. Going back to work can be a huge challenge. Our issue was finding childcare. Other grandparents suffer with health issues, disabilities, and just finding a job at their age. Once we learned about TANF, we did apply, but we did not qualify even after we came from 2 incomes to 1 because we made $75 a month too much. Many grand families like ours cannot access TANF because of the asset limits. We were essentially penalized for responsibly saving for our retirement. We used our credit cards, our savings account, and some of our 401k funding to care for our children. Today at 86, my husband has to work, and he works as a school crossing guard for us to make ends meet each month. Having spent most of our savings to provide for the children, we now hope that we don't have to ask for financial assistance as we get older. Many states offer child-only TANF grants, which generally do not consider the family's assets or income. However, the amount is vastly lower. While it's valued and essential, the amount of these grants are largely inadequate to provide for the children's needs. To survive and thrive, families routinely must piece together other assistance from food banks and clothing closets. Often, they simply go without. Another barrier accessing TANF is the requirement is to collect child support. If the state tries to locate the families to collect child support, caregivers have reported that the parents become angry and they threaten the grandparents, that they will remove the children, putting the children back in harm. Some grandparents fear for their own safety as well because the parents still have keys to the family home. So grandparents often choose not to pursue TANF and suffer emotionally and financially for the concerns of the children and themselves. Please keep the grand families in mind when you move forward with the TANF Assistance for Needy Families. I have included specific recommendations in my written testimony for consideration. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and your consideration on behalf of grand families.
Well, thank you, Ms. Gray, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for the valuable testimony you provided today and the work that you do in your different fields. At this time, we're going to proceed to question and answer by our committee members, and I'll begin with that session now. Mr. Collins, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned during your time in the Bush administration, that was the last time we had a reauthorization of TANF in 2005, and that was to deal with some of these issues that we talked about today and to reset the work participation rate. Can you explain what problems prompted these changes and if you think any of those same solutions would work today?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. The problem was actually a good one, and that was that states had done a great job of getting people off of the caseload, and they enjoyed a really generous caseload reduction credit. So it essentially brought the 50% rate down to zero. So states really didn't have a rate to meet. So that was the challenge, and I think what we would do today has to include some other pieces of reform. I would recalibrate the work participation rate calculation, the caseload reduction credit calculation more frequently, perhaps even biannually. But today, because of the other things that have happened with TANF, you also have to look at solely state-funded options state has to move people out of the rate. There are other things that happen with MOE, and there's a bunch of loopholes that you have to close. Doing the rate by itself, recalibrating the caseload reduction credit by itself, won't address the issues to make sure more individuals receive TANF assistance.
Thank you for that. I'll turn to Ms. Francis next. To count towards a state's work participation rate, TANF recipients must engage in a minimum number of hours in order to, in either core or supplemental activities. Can you provide examples of how this causes case workers to provide workarounds or take a hit on their evaluations when helping recipients get the training they need to enter the workforce?
Thank you for that question. Yes, a lot of times our customers come in and they are required to participate in a certain amount of hours. In job search, job readiness, we know that they only have a set amount of hours that they can complete for the year. And so if they come in and they use those hours already, but that is the component that they need to be in order to be successful in our program, to overcome any barriers or things of that nature, once they run out of those hours, we can no longer use that component and they're not counting towards the rate. And then also we have situations where you might have a adult who comes in over the age of 20 who wants to participate in getting their GED. So we have to put them in another component along with their GED, because over the age of 20, it does not count currently for them. So we have to combine them into another activity, which could be stressful for the customer to try to juggle both of those things at the same time. So it's kind of hard. And as far as taking a hit from our social workers, sometimes if they're not meeting the rate, we'll just keep them in that activity because we know it's going to be beneficial for them in the long run to be in that activity rather than just pushing them onto something else so that they can meet the rates.
Thank you for that. Ms. Reynolds, from your experience in research, what is the best measurement tool to help high work barrier individuals enter the workforce while still holding states, localities, and caseworkers accountable?
Great question, and thank you for that. I would say the most effective thing that we continue to see in study after study after study is the pairing of flexible financial assistance with robust case management, all leading to the outcome of education and upward mobility. I would say what we see again and again is when the federal government block grants dollars out to states and has requirements behind it, like in Family First, like in McVie, where we say these programs need to be run with evidence-backed program. The poor in our country deserve programs that actually are shown to work, and then those states can distribute those funds to those evidence-based programs. It makes all the difference. Some specific things we have seen in our research at Leo is Bridges to Success in Rochester, New York. They're getting amazing gains in employment and earnings because of mentorship, sequencing, and incentivizing certain behavior through flexible financial assistance. Padua at Catholic Charities Fort Worth, we're seeing tremendous gains in employment and earnings of low-income individuals, some who start as the working poor and some who start not working at all. And we're seeing awesome results too with the Goodwill Excel Centers that operate in 15 locations across this country, where we're seeing when you have students, adult students who did not graduate from high school come get their education, get post-secondary credentialing, all while being wrapped around with supports and case management. That is really the model that is helping individuals move into upward mobility.
Thank you for that. Mr. Moss, Michigan is one of the few states to integrate the TANF work requirements with workforce boards and services provided through the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. You are charged with making that effective at the local level. What do you see as challenges and opportunities for this type of model? And are there federal rules or regulations that make this connection difficult to replicate in other states?
That's a great question, Chair. I wish I knew that answer too. Only joking. All jokes aside, it's worked well for Michigan. I think with our state, we have an interagency agreement between the Department of Health and Human Services and our Workforce Development Department. While I would love to see that federally, obviously we're talking about federal versus local control in some of our states. Now we've seen the model with Texas, and Texas does it well. Obviously Michigan's doing it well. We've had great partnerships between these two departments where Michigan Works has been at the table, our Labor and Economic Opportunity Organization has been at the table, and DHS has been at the table. So it's always worked well for us. And again, focusing on skills and skill development and pushing back on the state a little bit around flexibility for that high school equivalency or GED, as Ms. Francis had mentioned, has been a key component to our success over the last few years. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for that, Mr. Moss. At this time, I'm going to recognize Ranking Member Mr. Davis for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of the witnesses. Ms. Gray, let me thank you especially for traveling here all the way from Phoenix and for sharing your experiences with us over the years as you have helped grandchildren and helped others to be able to help grandchildren. The most common reason that families stop receiving TANF benefits is failing to meet an administrative requirement, like filling out a form or attending a meeting scheduled by an agency or state. Can you tell us what it's like for grandparents when they see the forms or when they're told they have to meet all of these requirements, what their reactions are?
Thank you, Mr. Davis. So for grandfamilies or grandparents, we're talking about a group of people who have spent their lives working, saving for their retirement, and now are faced with raising additional children. A lot of the families that I work with, when they look at the TANF application, where in Arizona it was 58 pages long, and they only really needed like 6 or 7 pages. It was very frustrating for them to go through it. The application is long, it's difficult to navigate, and the questions sometimes are not, the families don't understand what they're asking for. So a lot of times the family will go through it, fill in different pages, and be denied simply because they put in the wrong information. Some of the families that I work with in their 70s and 80s are a little illiterate. They don't understand it, and you have to help them fill the forms out. So when they're tasked with doing this, they feel like they can't get it done, and they just stop. And it's very hard for them to do it while they're still caring for children. Some great-grandparents were placed with 3 children, and still with the care for them and the daily needs that they needed, they had to go through 58 pages of a TANF application.
68 pages?
It was 58 pages.
58
Yes.
pages.
Yes, sir.
That's a lot of pages. Well, let me ask you, only about 4.5% of cases are closed because of a failure to file a child support case or attend school. But I know that child support requirements is the reason some grandparents don't apply at all. Can you tell us more about the situation where that's a problem and why it's important to look at the entire family structure when dealing with the case?
Yes, sir. So for the child-only TANF, it's still, it includes like sometimes the income. That's really not a problem for some because they're retired. They're living off of $2,000, $2,500 a month. But when you look at the overall, if it's your biological child and you're caring for the children out of the state welfare system, you leave yourself open to what a lot of grandparents complained about, being threatened or intimidated. If you apply for these funds, the state is going to come after us, so we're going to remove the children from you. That only puts the children back in danger again. So a lot of grandparents will not apply for that because they don't want to lose the children and have the children be put in a situation that caused them to be removed in the first place.
If you were given advice to an agency that administers a program to be helpful, what would you ask or tell them to do?
Yes, sir. So I've heard a lot here about the TANF and the application, and we're talking about a lot of families. We're not talking about 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds. We even have 80-year-old families who've worked already and just need to experience their retirement. So one of the things that I would ask that the committee look at is, at these ages, there are those disabilities. They have mobile issues. They can't get around. They have families that are getting knee replacements and hip replacements, and they still have to chase around a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, and it causes a lot of problems. I think if we can take a look at what the grand family situation really is, then we can take a look at more of how we can help them. But these grand families are really suffering because they're spending the money that they've worked so hard for to keep ends to meet for these children and to keep them safe and stable in their home. So if we could take a look at the resources as far as what would a 60 or 70-year-old family member need to care for a 3-year-old, I think it would add a little more incentive to help these families, because these families are struggling. They're really struggling.
Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Consistent with committee practice, we'll now proceed with 2-to-1 questioning, and I'll recognize Mr. Carey of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. I want to thank you all the panelists, for taking time to come before this subcommittee and testify. Your experiences, your expertise will help inform us as we work to take a look at our current welfare system, make the reforms to help America become more self-sufficient, and transition from federal assistance into the workforce. In 2022, TANF funds served over 1 million families in the U.S., which included 2 million children. In my home state of Ohio, the TANF program serves more than 41,000 families, including 68,000 children. As many of the witnesses mentioned in their testimonies, the current TANF program requires states to track work participation rates, which do not effectively further the objectives of the program and are not a good measure to success. Ohio's workforce agencies has worked to innovate and provide assistance to low-income young adults to build careers and break the cycle of poverty. Through the comprehensive case management and employment program, Ohio utilizes funds from both TANF and Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act to provide workforce-related services to eligible Ohioans who are 14 to 24. This innovative program utilizes performance metrics like education or training after completing the program and credentials attain rates instead of work participation rates to assess participants. Listen, I look forward to continuing to discuss how states like mine are innovating these programs and how we can highlight the best practices to provide a helping hand to Americans on the road to self-sufficiency. First question, Mr. Moss, back in my home district, I hear all the time from employers, from Intel to LG to Honda, that continue to invest and want to create more jobs in Ohio, in and around the district. How can we reform TANF to help move current and future welfare recipients into the workforce and into those open positions quickly as possible?
That's a great question, Representative Carey, and thanks for the opportunity to answer. We are hearing, frankly, across the country and across West Michigan of just the challenge that our employers are experiencing with hiring, attracting, retaining. Individuals in the TANF program that we serve oftentimes have a number of barriers that we need to address first. So working with our state, we made sure that we allowed a barrier removal activity, which was new to us in 2020, to really spend some time and deeply in these individuals of removing any barriers that they have. Finding childcare takes time. Dealing with legal issues takes time. Dealing with housing issues takes time. And so working with our state, we've added a barrier removal in that activity. But also it's that skills, Representative. They need to have the skills that our employers need in order to remain competitive and stay within our regions. And so we need activities like GED completion and high school equivalency, because a lot of employers are still requiring it, at least to get your foot in the door, but also for advancement for those companies too. If our goal is to break the generational cycle of poverty, we need those tools in order to help individuals in the long run. And then for us, it's short-term training and skills. It sounds like you're doing some great work in Ohio and in the partnerships with Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. My predecessor for Region 5 coordinator, Christine Quinn, had always told me, how do we take best practices and turn them into common practices? So how do we take examples like what Ohio's doing and spread them across the country? So thank you for the question, Representative.
Thank you. Ms. Francis, as I mentioned earlier, my home state of Ohio has innovated within one of its programs to measure performance outcomes rather than work participation. In your testimony, you mentioned how the work participation rate takes the human aspect out of casework. Can you explain why this is? And you only have a minute. I apologize.
It's all right. Because we are dealing with individuals who they are in homeless situations. They might have mental health or behavioral physical concerns. They might have substance use concerns. And so when we overlook that and just putting them into a component, it doesn't end up the way that we will want it to turn out. We need to be able to come up with some type of way that we can measure the steps that they're taking when they're addressing those issues, and that be an outcome that we can use as showing them successfully partnering with our program. But that we lose that human aspect when we don't include that with when we're making decisions as far as our customers being successful in the program.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. I'll turn now to Mr. Blake Moore of Utah.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member. Mr. Reynolds, quick question. I want to jump in. Just set some context for today's hearing, and then I've got a few more questions. Overall, TANF as it exists today, what areas can we improve? Right? How do we make sure that this is an opportunity to incentivize the dignity of work? Like, just give me your quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, what I would say is we need evidence-based programs. So about right now, 22% of TANF dollars are spent on cash assistance to families. The rest are spent on other things like workforce training and so forth. Those dollars that are supporting programs need to be backed by evidence. There's tons of programs that are being developed and already have evidence behind them that they work. Let's invest in those things.
Awesome. So has anybody, as a curiosity, has anybody on the stand here in the witness stand, has anybody ever used the theory of change model or logic model in associated with your work, right? Like, so I get really kind of geeky about this, and I think back to my old consulting days where we have the whole set. We have the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact, right? What are we doing to be able to move this down the value chain so we're actually measuring success as opposed to just how many hours you're working, what are you doing, what are the simple things you're doing? That's a part of it. I'm never going to say that's not a key part of it. That's a part of the value chain, but what are we ultimately doing to move that down? I would love to just kind of hear your thoughts. Ms. Francis, the most, not that Congress isn't amazing and it's such a wonderful job, but the most impactful work I've ever done in my life was when I worked with Opportunity Youth prior to this role, and we worked with a big financial organization that was working with Youth Build, that was really trying to, find ways for opportunity youth, those that are 16 to 24-year-olds that are neither working nor in school, are actually trying to get into the workforce, and they have to find. And you're right, there's a stratified approach. Some have certain basic needs met. Some have had major tragedy, and we need to meet where they are so we can lift everybody up. What, in your opinion, can we be doing to capture the data? Because it's so important to be able to identify data and what the things we need to be monitoring so we can move down this value chain. And I'll just kind of throw that to the table. Ms. Francis, if you'd want to maybe offer some thoughts, because I know you love that stratified approach.
To capture the data, I think that we just need a better system of what our customers are actually participating in. We have vocational training, we have all these other instances, but we need, like I was saying before, if they've gone through trauma, we need a way to address that. We need a way to measure that. In where we come from, Mecklenburg County, we have social workers who assess them when they come in the door. And so we know where they're at, what their educational level is, and everything of that, and putting them in the most accurate component that will address those issues for them. But like you said, yes, we do need to come up with a better, more comprehensive way to measure what is being done by our customers.
In particular, is there anything the federal government is doing right now that actually hinders your ability to meet those individuals where they're at and help them out? I mean, was there something we should be moving away from?
The rate. I'm sorry, but yes, the rate, because it does not measure. I mean, you can job search for 86 hours for a month, but it does not measure what the customer is actually achieving. It's just a number.
Ms. Reynolds.
Yes, I love your logic model. I geek out on logic models too. What I would love to see at the very end of that logic model is families' dignity restored because they're living a life outside of poverty. And to me, I've seen a lot of our partners, something that matters to me is where it's living wage income, where they have no harmful debt and they have appropriate savings and then ultimately are off of government assistance as well. I love how when Chairman LaHood talked about, opened up our hearing, he talked about people trampolining out of poverty. And as I think about my 11-year-old daughter on a trampoline, you look at a child on a trampoline and they start bouncing, and then it gets higher and higher. And I think what we have to remember is when we're helping people trampoline out of poverty, they don't get to the end of that logic model overnight. They get a little better and a little better and a little better, and then they get that momentum so they can be out and free of government assistance. And so the more we can do to surround people with the supports they need to meet them where they're at today and provide them with someone who will do life with them to navigate all of this, I think can really work.
Mr. Connells, anything to add on the data perspective or in your work?
I actually agree with the other panelists. It's important to move people ultimately to impacts so that we can measure really what it was that we tried to do in the beginning. And I actually think that Congress can set the table by reframing what good looks like so that states can build anti-poverty programs instead of anti-penalty programs. It's important that we improve from where we are. A lot of things got layered in over the last couple of opportunities to sort of look at TANF and reauthorization when I was there then. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility that states have to do various things, and I think we should preserve that element, but find ways to evolve where we are on the accountability side.
And I'll just say, I think this is the really cool, neat thing about this committee and why I'm excited to be on this subcommittee is because from Ms. Gray's testimony all the way down to Mr. Collins, there is a fundamental problem. If you've ever felt like, additional income is actually going to hurt you, we need to address that. Ms. Gray, your testimony is emotional, and I just wanted to thank you for your time and what you've given to your family. And that issue that you brought up is something that I go to my state leaders and work on, and we find ways to actually make reasonable solutions there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. I recognize Ms. Chu for 5 minutes.
Ms. Gray, I want to thank you for your testimony today. Of the main barriers for families looking to participate in the workforce is access to affordable childcare. Childcare across the nation is extremely costly. In my home state of California, families pay more than $13,000 annually, which is hard for middle-income families to afford, but even more out of reach for low-income families or those living in poverty. Now, currently, 30% of a state's TANF dollars can be transferred to childcare, but on average, states only spend about 17% of those dollars on childcare. You mentioned in your testimony that a lack of childcare options presented a barrier for you to go back to work. How might access to affordable quality childcare have impacted this decision?
Great question. So for me, it was a medical issue of the child that hindered us from getting the child care. No one wanted to take on the responsibility of a child that had that medical conditions. In my testimony that I sent in was only half of what she went through as a child when we took her in. Her medical issues were far more than I stated in the testimony. So it wasn't that we couldn't get it, it was that the child care system itself, no one wanted to take on the liability or the responsibility of a child that was that sick. The other thing is, in a lot of the grand families that I work with, we're never told of what our options are. We're not told that this is available. Like in the beginning, my husband and I were not told about TANF. So to know that there's also child care available under TANF would be a great help for a lot of the families. They don't know it exists. But we're also talking about 70 and 80-year-olds who have retired and are at home, so they don't really need the child care, but it's very essential to the caregiver to also have some time or what we call respite in order for them to get together and refocus in order to care for the children. As a grand family member myself, my goal was always to make it better for my grandchildren, even supporting them no matter which way it took, including depleting our finances.
Well, thank you for that. And we know that the overwhelming majority of TANF recipients are children. That is child-only cases in which only the child receives benefits and not any of the adults in the household. And now we have a rising number of grandparent caregivers across the country. And in fact, grandparent households now make up a large share of child-only TANF recipients. In your experience, would work requirements such as logging hours of community service or learning new skills for a minimum wage impact your ability to care for your loved ones?
Yes, so for me, it would have, because what her medical needs were, my day was spent with cardiology, neurologists, ophthalmologists, infectious disease clinic. This is what we went through, and that's the reason I had to quit, because we couldn't find anyone to care for her at those needs. So when you're talking about an 80-year-old or 70-year-old going back to work, we don't have employers that are trying to take in 70-year-olds to hire them. And there's a lot of things that they can do on community service. But for me, and I can only speak for me in this instant, it was hard for me to leave my granddaughter because of her medical issues. There was so much that needed to be done for her on a daily.
Yeah. Well, and then finally, let me ask about TANF and foster care. States that implemented full family TANF sanctions for lack of compliance with work requirements actually had an increase of 12.7% in children entering foster care. Now, research shows that access to public benefit programs such as TANF are an important protective factor to keep kids out of the child welfare system and out of foster care. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how cash assistance through TANF can help keep families together and out of the foster care system. Can you share a little bit there?
Yes, ma'am. So in Arizona, they had limited the TANF to 24 months and then down to 12 months. When a grandparent would go to apply for the TANF, they were told that the biological parents had used the allotted time. So in Arizona, they called it the grandparent penalty. At that point, I went to speak to my legislators, and we were able to get that, what they call the grandparent penalty, removed so that grandfamilies could access that money. It was really kind of tough and hard because they look at a lot of things, but when they talk about situations, they're not looking at the age of the families. And the grandparents are struggling.
Yeah, but because of that, you kept your children out of the foster care system.
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chu. Recognize Ms. Steele of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this hosting for this hearing, and thank you all the witnesses coming out. And this is very important meeting. By empowering people and connecting them with employers, we are setting up our constituents and communities to be successful. This can be generational change. When I was an Orange County supervisor, I led the yearly job and hiring fair, and during the pandemic, we still offered it, but virtually. I look forward to working with my colleagues to help people gain skills by updating WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and TANF. I just want to ask a few questions to Ms. Francis. In your testimony, you mentioned the 60 to 40% of people who are ready to work and those with higher barriers to work. Would you share how you and your staff differentiate and approach ready-to-work individuals and higher barrier individuals? And do you have examples how your staff handles these higher barrier cases and how federal law might be hindering their efforts?
Thank you. Yes, so when a customer comes into our department, we do a full assessment. We assess them for all the needs of the family. We provide a two-gen approach. We're not just looking at the parent, we're looking at the entire family and their needs. And then the social worker will assess from that point what this customer needs for themselves and their family to be stable. Because that's one of the main factors that's important is stability of the family to be able to participate in the TANF program. And so once they come in and we assess them, there are some, like I said before, who have a high school diploma. They might have some other skills, and they just need a step up, like we said, the trampoline. They need a step up in order to get, so we might connect them to trainings. We might connect them to the local community college and things of that nature just to get certification or something of that nature. But then we have other ones who come in and they are dealing with a amount of issues that are going on. So they might have mental health, they might be homeless and things of that nature. And when we assess them, we partner with our community partners to provide resources to that family, to the whole entire family, not just the person coming in and applying. And so that is the way that we're able to support the family. And then we have a social worker who meets with them on a regular and consistent basis to make sure that they are reaching the goals that we have established on our agreement and that we're providing support to them as well.
And then could you share with the committee more about the work and partnership your office with NCW, North Carolina Works? How does this program connect with WIOA outcome measurement?
I would say that, and I apologize, I'm not familiar with every component of your question, but I will say that we do partner with WIOA to assist our customers financially to be able to go through training programs. So our vocational training, so we will send them through WIOA. They provide the funding, their support with connecting them to a vocational training, and that's how we support our customers.
So you're assessing those people that they have ability to work.
Yes.
And then they have some problems that they try to advise them that how you're gonna fix it. And then that you have training program to make them that they get trained and they're gonna work.
Yes.
Thank you. And Ms. Reynolds, are there states that are doing innovative programming with basic TANF assistance that you would point to as uniquely successful? How could this be replicated in other states?
What I think has been most successful is when the federal government has said, given resources to states and set expectations of the percentage of those resources that need to have rigorous evidence behind them that they work. So we understand it is that service, it is that program that makes the difference, not some other economic condition going on. We've seen that with MCV, we've seen that with Families First legislation and some success there. What I would say is if we could look at the resources that states have and then disperse those resources to oftentimes private providers across the state who have evidence-backed programs that we know work, like Goodwill Excel Centers, I think we would be making tremendous gains.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Recognize Mr. Smucker of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the steps that we can take to improve TANF and ensure that it's effective for supporting those that need it. I want to first say thank you to each of you who in different ways are ensuring that you're helping those who need help in the community. I think we're all grateful to live in a country where there is a safety net, there is help for people who need it, and that people care enough about their neighbors to ensure that that is provided. I do also want to say that I think we all believe that the best path out of poverty is a great paying job and a family sustaining job, and that should be the goal of all of our programs, and I know that you all believe that as well. I was interested in some of the discussion. I think Ms. Francis and Ms. Reynolds sort of talked about some of this. In fact, probably all of my questions have already been touched on, but specifically how we can find the right balance between, you mentioned, Ms. Reynolds, case management. I think it's really important that at a local level, not only are case managers able to make the decisions that best channel the resources for a particular family or person in need, but also then that there's a coordination among various agencies or services that are available, and I'm sure each of you are doing that. But what's the right balance on that? Because on the other hand, from the perspective of a policymaker at the federal level, when dollars are going out to states, we want to ensure that there's some accountability there. So, for instance, we want connection with a job, but we also want the caseworker to not just be incentivized to find the first job. Maybe we do, but really we want a job that's family sustaining, and so it needs to be outcome based rather than just incentivized on on process. And so, you know, that idea of federal accountability versus flexibility, what's the best balance? How can we think about that as we're reauthorizing or improving TANF?
Yeah, so the way I would specifically answer that is I think intensive case management, that's one part like connection, meeting today's needs, and the other part about goal planning for tomorrow and trampolining out of poverty has got to be the right balance. The way I would encourage a drive to accountability is measure what matters and measure what you're saying, that good paying job, because you're right, that is the best anti-poverty strategy there is. But allow for time for it to get there. One of our studies on Padgett, Catholic Charities Fort Worth, the average amount of time it takes someone to go through that is about 2 to 2.5 years. It doesn't happen overnight. And so what we have to remember is that people who are trying to get out of poverty don't usually start at a place with a master's degree. Oftentimes, they're starting at a place where they're undereducated and need the skills to qualify for these wonderful jobs. And so giving that time is important. I do want to also note, one of the great things about building evidence is you can also do some cost estimating to really understand the ROI of those particular services. And so in the case I just explained, the great thing is people who came into the program employed 8 years afterwards, the cost to provide that service was made up for. For those who come into the program unemployed, 5 years after they complete the program, it made up for it. So often the return on investment of these programs can be strong. We just have to have a little longer vantage point.
Thank you. And the other thing I just want to mention, I only have a minute left, is also WIOA, or some were referring to it as the WIOA, or the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act. I serve on the Educational Workforce Committee as well, and reauthorization of WIOA is something that we hope to do this particular year or session at least. And there are some performance accountability indicators built into WIOA that I think there ought to be, you know, maybe some kind of interconnectivity between the two. And so, you know, I don't know if anybody would want to speak to that. For instance, there's an indicator of effectiveness that track if WIOA is meeting the critical workforce needs of the business community by measuring retention with the same employer. There are other measures which address WIOA's efforts to provide quality services to all employers and sectors within a state, local economy. What would be the impact if we took some of those same methods or measures and apply them to TANF? You know, would this, you know, could we learn from that, and could we tie them together in a way to hold states accountable?
I mean, Representative, I love where your head's at, and I appreciate you looking at WIOA reauthorization. We're hopeful that you get something done too this year. You know, for me, it works well for our state because our business solutions team is working with both TANF recipients and Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act recipients. So it makes a lot of sense from our standpoint to use those measures. It's a little easier for our state then, right? The challenges with other states is you might have multiple people all reaching out to employers saying, hey, I have this person, let me help you, you know, get them placed, and I have other resources to help offset with on-the-job training and other tools. The challenge with some of those business metrics too is that there's no dedicated funding stream for business solutions either. So you know, I think when I look at some of those key metrics that we want to track, it's the credential rate, it's entered employment rate, and ultimately it's earnings, right? We want these people to have good jobs and jobs that are going to sustain their family and be self-sustaining and break the generational cycle of poverty. And so I think ultimately, you know, it comes down to some of those job metrics. But I truly appreciate where your head's at and willingness to serve on both of these.
Yeah, thank you. I know I'm out of time, and I appreciate the chairman the time, but hope to continue to have those discussions going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. Recognize Ms. Moore of Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I just really appreciate everything that the witnesses have said today. It would be so very easy to just say amen and yield back, because I agree with many of the things that you all have said. My time is limited, so just let me get straight into things. First of all, I just want to respond, Mr. Chairman, to some of the things that I've heard you say and the chairman of the full committee say, and just sort of set the record straight on a couple of things. At first, it's the sort of the misnamed nature of this committee that somehow restoring the work requirements are going to lift people out of poverty. I didn't hear a single one of these witnesses affirm that. They, in fact, have talked about the many barriers that they have and the structure of the program being such that it doesn't enable people to get out of poverty. Mr. Davis made a point earlier that I just think is worth reiterating. Is that 77% of the people who are under the TANF program now are children, and 68% of those are under the age of 12. So I don't know who it is we're imposing these work requirements on. We've heard testimony from all of our witnesses here. I think from Ms. Francis that some of the countable activities that might help people get out of poverty, activities, like being able to go to the local vocational school to maybe become an LPN or something. If that took you 2 years, Miss Reynolds and Miss Francis, would that be allowed under the current TANF rules? No, it would not. And that would certainly be an activity that would help you trampoline out of poverty to get a credential or certification, as Mr. Moss sort of indicated here. I have heard you talk about the case management. And Ms. Francis, you have social workers, people with MSWs. I don't know how that's scalable with unless you use resources from your own state. With the TANF dollars, it just is not feasible to give the whole population that kind of life coach, helping them get in school and make sure they get their degree. And I don't see that as really being the case. I think it's more in line with what Mr. Collins has shared with us. And that is simply that states have flexibility to do what they want to do with the money. And instead of giving that kind of wraparound support, they give themselves bonuses, they give themselves a higher pay, they build, and I don't know why people are ragging on poor Brett Favre. I mean, he is not the only person who did that. He does not deserve to be ragged on like that. I've had communities in my district where they did underground improvements for luxury apartments with TANF dollars. And so, I think that there's a disincentive in this program to actually help the people because private agencies can use the money as they want. We don't allow people to get education and training. I was there at the scene of the crime in Wisconsin when they ended welfare as we know it. And I know that 10,000 women dropped out of school the day we passed it. Okay, so forget about lifting people out of poverty through education. Quite frankly, the 11 million jobs that are open, let me just tell you something. I only have 57 seconds. Let me tell you a little story. The last time I was arrested for protesting for a $15 an hour wage. And then after that, I went to sit with the good old boys on the south side of my district. And they said, Congresswoman, we don't, with all due respect, we ain't gonna work for no $15 an hour. We got car notes, house mortgages, kids in college. We're not gonna do that. In order to qualify for TANF, you have to make something like 50% under minimum wage. You could work for $7.25 an hour, 52 weeks a year, 40 hours a week, and that would disqualify you to get Medicaid in my state. There's no incentive what is the incentive to work? If all it does is create a situation where you're ineligible for support. So this program only works for those people that we supply and provide the low-wage workforce with its essential workers. Employers that their business plan relies on part-time people who they can give them any kind of schedule they want. You work 4 hours today, 12 tomorrow. It incurs no cost for the business. They'll take minimum wage, any old job. I can tell you, we should do what Bill Clinton said we should do, and that is we should end welfare as we know it. We should do that, people. We should give people the child tax credit. These witnesses have already told you. This woman here says she's an expert at Notre Dame. Then you give people money, most of them will figure out how to take care of their kids. My time is expired, and I know you're gonna gavel me. I don't get the magic minutes here, so I wanna put some things in the record without objection. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Gray, before I go, I just wanna look at this application that you claim you had to fill out and put this in the record for you to get assistance, and just ask you a couple of real quick questions. You had this 30-page Arizona Department of Economic Security to fill out, and you had to have court-ordered child support paid, turn that over to them, adult dependent care expenses, medical expenses, what your mortgage payments were, your utilities, and other housing costs. Is that true?
Yes.
All right. So I want to put this in the record without objection.
Without objection, it's entered in the record.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much. And with that, I would unwillingly yield back because I have so many questions to ask you all. But I do want to end by thanking you for your appearance here today.
Thank you very much. We recognize Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly thank you to all of our witnesses. I apologize I had to step out briefly, but this is important stuff. And so I appreciate you sharing your perspective. And I had the honor and privilege of chairing this subcommittee previously. And we held the multi-hearing series on TANF, excuse me. And that series actually led to legislation that I was happy to introduce, the Jobs for Success Act, when it was introduced for the first time. And many of the factors we considered back in 2018 still remain true now. The overall workforce participation rate is below 63%. It remains well below what it was when we had the 2008 financial crisis. Employers everywhere desperately need workers, and starting wages for people returning to the workforce actually reflect that as well. Unfortunately, many of the problems with TANF, which had arisen over the past 2 decades, I think they still remain. And the good news is, however, is that we found several potential areas, I think, for bipartisan agreement back in 2018. We can do more to ensure TANF is focused on helping those most in need. We can ensure states do more to help get Americans off the sidelines by working with them one-on-one whenever possible to connect them with employers who need them. And we can do more to ensure states are empowered to help people successfully remain in the workforce after they get that full-time job. So it's not just about getting a job and staying in place. It's about an upward trajectory that I think we all can agree would be better in many ways, but primarily for the individual in need. Mr. Collins, could you go into details for the committee on some of the games that states might play to meet their work participation rate, and how exactly does the small check scheme work, and what states are the biggest offenders?
Okay.
Not to put you on the spot.
So assume you were a state that had a rate to meet. The first problem is that because of the generosity of the caseload reduction credit, most states really had a effectively zero rate to meet, but some did actually have a rate to meet. What they were able to do is to, at their discretion, remove from the TANF participation denominator adults likely to unmeet the rate by what we call solely state funding those cases. So they could just pull them out of the denominator, which would just increase the numerator as a result. The state could choose to solely fund enough cases to meet the rate in a month, or they could do it at the end of the year and just go back and sort of buy out a number of cases so they would actually meet the rate. So there's 3 different ways a state could use the solely state-funded option. As far as the small check scheme, it's almost in the reverse. The state would be able to find a TANF profile case, an adult working already with a child, and then bring them on the caseload by providing a very small amount of TANF, $20 or $30 a month. That would be enough to put them in the rate. So on the one hand, you solely fund out, and then you can do a token TANF payment to put more in the rate.
And I think it's safe to say that in any of those cases, individuals are not necessarily helped.
Absolutely. The
And
concern,
certainly
yes.
not a brighter future
No.
for individuals facing scenarios like that. So I appreciate that insight. Mr. Moss, in your testimony, you spoke about how the work participation rate doesn't always align with a client's needs. What are some of the problems with the work participation rate, and do you have some specific examples?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest examples is the success story that I submitted in my written testimony. So we had an individual that lacked a high school diploma or GED. She lacked transportation and some of the basic services that we can provide, and we were able to enroll her into GED, and we did it full time. So she met her requirements as to what we were asking her for, but technically we failed performance for that individual, and we not only failed it for her, but we failed it for her husband because she came to us as a two-parent family. So he also was enrolled in GED. But we know that, with these supports and by doing something that felt ethically right, even though we were failing some of the local performance, we were able to get her GED, we were able to get her certified nursing assistant, and we were able to get her a job, which is probably most important, right? And so, with that, she's now working full-time, and the employers filled a much-needed position as a certified nursing assistant, which a lot of our employers are struggling with today. So, that's just one example. There are other examples around job search and the fifth week not counting towards participation. I'm not sure why that happens or how it happens, but we get flagged in our system what week the fifth week is. On the short months, it becomes very challenging for that. And then also individuals that get referred to us mid-month, if they start the middle of January, we're going to have a hard time meeting those hours for the month. So that person's probably going to count against our performance too, even though they've done everything that we've asked them to do during the short window that we've had it. So I don't know why things aren't prorated. It's a little above my head or pay grade or maybe my knowledge base. I feel like you need a PhD to understand these work requirements, and I do not have one, unfortunately.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I recognize Ms. Tenney of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the ranking member. This is great. You're tremendous witnesses. I've been involved in a lot of this as a state legislator and in New York where we have particular issues, and we really appreciate your input on how to solve this problem. I was on the Social Services Committee, and we never really solved it. In fact, I just read an Inspector General's report for New York State that gives us lousy scores. But I want to talk about a couple quick things if I can. Number one is every one of us have touched on this, but the real problem with employers, and I'm an employer in New York State, and if I walk into any store, any shop, any business, any manufacturing firm, everybody needs employees. It's a huge problem. New York is lagging behind all the other states pretty much, except I think for 6 in labor participation. In fact, we're down 104,000 jobs as of where we stand today. And if we kept pace with the rest of the country on average, we should have in our last data, the Bureau of Labor Statistics would have had 320,000 more private sector jobs. So we have an issue getting people to work, but we recognize this is not such an easy climb. And I love my colleague, Ms. Moore's reference as calling us life coaches or calling you life coaches in what you do in TANF. But I do think, and I want to address this to Mr. Collins, because I know a number of you have already kind of jumped on this, but you made some really good statement in your early testimony, and you talked about the state of TANF being an anti-poverty versus an anti-penalty reform. And it really struck my interest because, it's the outcomes versus process issue. And I'm a former divorce lawyer, so I'll tell you, lawyers in divorce law, it doesn't matter what the outcome is, as long as they can milk the file and keep it going as long as possible, they make a lot of money. And I'm getting the impression this is how TANF works in some cases, like a state like New York. The incentive is not to get the person to gainful employment and success. It's just to keep the hours going and not really get an outcome. So can you explain to me a little bit about that process and how we can maybe give flexibility to the states, how we can give incentives based on outcomes and getting people to gainful employment, at least on the road to gainful employment? and I know you're an expert on this.
Great. Thank you, Congresswoman. So the first thing I'd want to let everybody know is that states right now, as I mentioned before, have a very small actual work requirement. So the concern that I have with that is that most states meet their rate by actually having people in work. And that sounds odd. What I mean by that is if you're not in work, there's probably no other activity that you're doing that counts towards the rate. So states have a tremendous amount of flexibility to do whatever activities they deem necessary to move somebody to self-sufficiency, including all of the pre-work that you have to do with individuals that are homeless or individuals who have challenges with substance abuse treatment. There's a tremendous amount of state flexibility currently there for states to be able to take advantage of that.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it true that one of the biggest limitations of the work rate is that states don't need to move TANF recipients into actual paid employment to meet the rate?
So there's 12 allowable activities. Almost 90% of participation comes from putting people in jobs. So my concern is slightly different. I want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to be helped into work. And the challenge is, right now, that's not going on. What is counting are people in work and only people in work. So if you have a pathway that you need to go through before that, my challenge is let's get everybody in the game so that we can get them where they need to be. So my really point is that the flexibility is tremendous. And I think what we need to do is we need to tighten some of that in terms of an accountability measure to make sure that states are doing what I just mentioned.
Great, thank you. Mr. Moss, I just wanted to mention, I go back to my life coach example from Ms. Moore, but I used to work for a group, volunteer, called the Women's Employment Resource Center, which was once called the Displaced Homewakers. We had to modernize our terminology, but it was a great group, and they actually did act as life coaches, and we worked with women to bring them up to speed. And I was just going to ask you if you could talk about a little bit of your interaction with workforce development boards and getting people to that point where they can actually identify employers, employees, and work with people who are desperate to find good employees, and then we can get them on the path to success.
Yeah, we're really fortunate. We have a women's resource center in West Michigan too, so that's interesting.
Great.
So they've been great to partner with early on in my career. But we have a business solutions team that works both with TANF and WIOA, Trade Act, as well as Wagner-Pfizer participants. And so, we're able to leverage those relationships with those employers, that it doesn't matter which funding stream the person came from, but it's more about that relationship with that employer. So it's worked really well for us. The challenge, as I mentioned, there are very few states across the country that are integrated like our state is. Obviously, we'd love to see more. It's my own bias. Our board is heavily focused on outcomes of getting people jobs and getting them placed into meaningful employment. And I know there are other boards across the country. I think there's 550 across the country that are doing similar work and great work in each of your states. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. My time's out. And I wish you could all come and do a roundtable discussion in New York. And I want to just especially say thank you to Ms. Gray for fostering all those children. We're really lucky to have you, and so are they. So thank you for your warmth and your compassion for these people. Appreciate it. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Tenney. I recognize Mr. Evans of Pennsylvania.
Most states had like zero caseload reduction. Now, that was during COVID, remember? I mean, I remember because I had my oldest son almost die of COVID on January 1st, 2021. People hadn't had any vaccines. So I just want to put this in some context when we start talking about, and we suspended time limits and stuff because people couldn't go to work. It was kind of hard to go find a job during COVID. I just want to clean that up before we leave. Also, Mr. Collins talked about, allowable activities. And so I just want to know, Mr. Moss and Ms. Francis, you guys got dinged on your workforce participation when you helped that woman become a CNA and her husband. You got dinged, didn't you?
Just a little bit, you know.
Right, but
I'm
you
happy to
didn't
take
meet-
those
you
bumps
didn't-
and bruises.
You didn't meet your expectations because you actually helped somebody out of poverty and you got dinged for it. Is that right?
We have enough across the region to be able to still meet work
But I
participation
mean, you
rate as
kind
an
of
organization.
manipulated it and kind of got around and
Well, we've
to
had a
help
great
this woman out.
we've had a great partnership with the state representative that allowed us that flexibility, and that's where they use those caseload reduction credits in what I would say a good way, right?
But,
Is
but
that-
if you did that too much, you would mess up.
I get in real trouble,
You'd be in
Representative.
real trouble if too many people got on that trampoline and got out of poverty. Thank you. Now yield back to Mr. Evans.
Thank you. Ms. Gray, to what extent did TANF help you feed and care for your grandchildren and foster children? Can you please expand how TANF work requirements made getting more difficult for you and your husband?
Yes, sir, thank you. We never received TANF. In the beginning, we weren't told about TANF, and then when we applied, we made $75 too much. So with that went our credit cards, our savings account, and going into our retirement fund.
From your own experience and from what you have heard from the other grandparents, caregivers, can you please speak to the burden of managing complicated paperwork, stated scheduled meetings, and other challenging requirements while trying to provide a safe, nurturing home for your grandchildren and foster children?
Yes, sir. So we're talking about grandparents that are in their 70s and 80s. They have mobile issues. Some of them can't get around. And so when it comes time for a meeting, they have to get to the meeting. They also usually have to bring the children with them. And so that creates that problem because childcare is not available. So when they're doing that, they're already in this mode that I can't do it. I'm just going to have to not make the meeting and those type of things. A lot of meetings were done during COVID virtually, which did help a lot of families make those meetings. But the thought of getting the children together to go to a meeting or finding someone to watch them was very hard. Reading through the TANF paperwork, there are forms and things that they were asked to fill out. And some of the things were hard to do if it was related to getting the parents for child support when they know that the family has already, the biological parents have already threatened to come and get the kids. So there were a lot of things that the grandparents go through that's very hard. They're torn between the love of their child and the love of their grandchildren. But in the long run, they're retired. They've done the work that they need to do, and they weren't looking to take in children. And in a lot of cases, like one of my grandmothers, she was a great-grandmother. They placed a set of twins, 15 weeks old, and the 18-month-old brother with her. And she lived on a second floor with no elevator. There was so many things that hindered her from getting out and doing the things that needed to be done. And a lot of the requirements don't make sense for, when you talk about TANF, don't make sense for grandfamilies. There needs to be a special section that helps grandfamilies.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. I recognize Dr. Winstrup of Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to hear all that you do. I can tell you as a physician, there's nothing more rewarding than taking care of someone in need. And that's what all of you are doing. You know, in Washington, you hope that the name of a program or the name of a bill lives up to its billing, right? And so temporary, one, is the first word, temporary assistance for needy families, right? Very appropriate. And, you know, look, all families all look different. They're not all the same. And not only that, every member of the family has different needs. And I think that that's sometimes what we miss out on this. Mr. Collins, you hit on something just as I came back in about the opportunity. You know, it's one thing to have a requirement, but the requirement's nothing if there's not an opportunity. And so how do we enhance the opportunities? And that's what I've always been about. You know, it's nice you can just say, well, you're required to go get a job. Well, that's easier said than done. You know, it's just not that simple for somebody who's starting out in poverty and then suddenly they need transportation to get to a job. There's all these factors that we all know come into play, and they're the barriers. So I think if we can focus more on opportunities, or at least allow at a local level that you can enhance opportunities for people, then the requirement, I think I like what you said, if I understood, Mr. Collins, is like the requirement should be that you participate in the pathway to an opportunity, then to job. That should be the requirement, and I agree with that 100%. Merely just saying it here doesn't mean it happens. We do that a lot here in Washington. Anyway, and it's not just the requirement, it's the result. And what does success look like? You know, that is the key. And I've got some great caseworkers in my district, and they're like, if they just let me alone to do what these people need, this family needs, this child, this individual or family, I can do so much more. And sometimes they have the opportunity, sometimes they just do it anyway and beg forgiveness later, right? You know, I meet a family with 6 kids living in a one-room cabin. He says, I can't take that 3rd shift job because I got nowhere to sleep when I come home. Okay. Do we need paperwork here to fix that, or can somebody who's looking that family in the eye take care of that situation? In that case, she was able to, and they went to work. So what does assistance look like, I think, is a case-by-case basis and not something we can define right here in Washington, D.C. And that's where I think as we go forward and we want to make adjustments to this program, we enhance that. And also, is there a way to reward the success we're all talking about, which is somebody getting into a job no longer needing assistance? And by the way, when you get a job, we don't want to make it so that you're worse off than you were before you got the job, as far as financially and what your family can eat. So I think we need to focus on a lot of local flexibility for caseworkers. And, like I said, needs different. Whether it's getting your high school degree to be able to get that job, let's make that happen. You know, if it's transportation, let's find a way to make that happen. Whether it's childcare, let's find a way to make that happen. So I'd be glad to hear from any of you and to help us as we might change the parameters so that you all can be successful. And you're all wonderful people, but Ms. Gray, I don't think I've met a living saint in my life, but you're right up there.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Collins.
Yes, so thank you, Congressman. I think there's more that we can do to reward work. Given all of the tools that are now in play, I think different than in 2005. States, I think, are trying to avoid penalties. They need to build an anti-poverty program, and in so doing, find more ways to reward work, spend more resources on rewarding work and helping people, ladder up once they get in. For example, income credits. There might be asset building match savings programs that can be added to when individuals go into work. And I think that's where we are. It really is about improving it and adding that kind of accountability from the federal level to allow states and counties really to innovate and to think through what is best for that family right there on the front lines.
And I would just add, ideally, that would be backed by evidence. You're a physician, and often, I would guess, when you treat your patients, you make sure you treat them in a way that the evidence backs up that treatment, that pill, that drug, that surgery is going to align. And unfortunately, in too many of our anti-poverty programs across this country, we don't treat our poor people that way. We don't give them the dignity to give them services that actually work and have that causal evidence like you would in the medical community. And we should demand that of our states.
I would just like to say that our grandfamilies, some of them are not in poverty. They've worked, they've saved, they're now living the life that they want to live in retirement. And then they get a phone call and they're placed with children in their care. They're making $2,500 a month and getting denied from TANF because they responsibly saved their money for their retirement. And now, what do? They are at an age where they're not always employed or get employment, or if they're able to, they're medically disabled or they've got health issues and they cannot work. So the program needs to take in consideration that every family is not the same, and that these families that were grandfamilies that saved and put their life together are now moving into poverty simply because they're now willing to take care of their children and keep them out of the state's care.
Thank you all very much. Very helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Winstrup. Our last member is Ms. Miller of West Virginia, who is not on the subcommittee, but thought this committee's topic today so important that we welcomed her to the subcommittee today. So welcome, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I used to be on this committee. So my heart is still here with so many of the issues and the years that I spent in the State House I'm from West Virginia. I understand poverty. I understand, and I love the word dignity because it's so important with what we're doing. And I can repeat, there have been no significant changes in TANF since 2005. And you would think that we would have been further along, but we have had lots of issues and we have had COVID come through. So this hearing, I think, is in the right step for the right direction in addressing the loopholes and the gaps. And it's our duty to help Americans in poverty to move out of it, to have that feeling, that self-satisfaction. And so I do believe in welfare to work. It is an important step. And we've just got to find effective policies and proposals to remove those barriers that you all have been talking about. I just reintroduced my legislation that I'd had in before called the Accelerating Individuals into the Workforce Act, now of 2023, which would reserve up to $100 million from the TANF Contingency Fund to subsidize the wages of TANF recipients for up to 12 months while they're trying to work by incentivizing their employers, like paying for part of their salary to these TANF recipients. The new employees will then receive on-the-job training, valuable experience. Business owners also understand that it's expensive to train people to work. And so it's a wonderful addition to the valuable experience that they will have in giving them a career. And so my legislation would invest in the well-being of the families in the TANF program by creating a direct pathway to employment for opportunities and success. So Ms. Francis, Mr. Collins, any of you, can you speak to the importance of the public-private partnerships in helping welfare recipients move into jobs, retain work, and increase their earnings over time?
Thank you for that question. I think what you brought up was a perfect example of how we could collaborate with jobs. We need to be putting our individuals, our customers, into higher paying positions. We know that minimum wage cannot support a family. And I do believe that employers will be more willing to accept people on to their payrolls if they did have an incentive to add those people on. And if someone can be trained on the job, get that skill, they're not going somewhere else, but they can get it on the job, they know that they're going to have that position, something that they can carry on forward or move up in that position, I think that would be something that would be very beneficial to our customers. Thank you.
Yes, the beauty of the block grant is that the state of West Virginia can do what the state needs to do and provide opportunities that way, and each and every other state has that same opportunity. So I think that's important to preserve. I would also always say that there needs to be, from this body, some level of accountability that drives more people through those pathways than the current framework does. The current framework allows way too many loopholes that don't give states enough pressure to get as many people through whatever activity that a case manager deems as important for them to do. So I think we need to close some of those loopholes up so that there are more opportunities to get people to higher paying jobs that employers need those employees right now.
Either of the other, any of you, and I do want to talk to Grandma at the end.
I was just going to add, once you get your act passed into law, we would be more than happy at Notre Dame to study the impact of it so you can build evidence so we can decide should it be expanded over time.
It's a great question, Representative, and thanks for being here. I would echo a lot of the statements that have already been provided. You know, early on in my career, I worked directly with employers and offered on-the-job training contracts and helping, you know, take the risk on hiring somebody with maybe a little lower skill set than what the employer had. And it always has been and still continues to be a valuable tool in our toolbox when working with employers and getting those job seekers connected to employment. So thank you for being here.
And I just want to say, bless you, Ms. Gray. In our state, sometimes we even have great-grandparents that are taking care of kids because, you know, we've had drug addiction and various things that have directly affected the family unit. And so you're so brave and so loving. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
I turn it back to you, boss.
Thank you, Congressman Miller. Well, that concludes our question and answer from our members here. I want to just mention one thing. We've heard a lot about grand families today. And just to remind folks that grand families don't have work requirements in TANF. They're considered child only. We aren't proposing work requirements for grandparents. I just wanted to make that clear. Let me just say in conclusion, as I've listened to the testimony of all 5 of you today and the questions and answers here today, it's really been remarkable. You've been here for over 2 hours, but your testimony and the question and answers, I think, have been very compassionate and informative and instructive in many ways, and helps guide all of us here as we look at policy solutions on how we reform TANF and what we can do to make the program better, because we're always looking at how do we make government more effective, efficient, and accountable. That's really what today is all about, and you guys were a big part of that. So again, thank you. We're grateful. I would just lastly say welfare reform was based on one simple idea shared by people of all political stripes, the belief that the best way out of poverty is a job, and that reducing poverty should be about helping people move from welfare to work. And so as we conclude today, again, we're grateful and thank you for your testimony and look forward to working with you. Please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal record here today. I want to thank Dr. Davis for your work with us on this subcommittee. And with that, the committee is adjourned. Thank you.